The Hell of Tasmania. The true story of the men who escaped the island of chains. There is a place at the bottom of the world where the wind never stops screaming, where the sea claws endlessly at the black cliffs, and where men once vanished into chains and silence. This place was called Tasmania, and in the 19th century it was known by another name, the Island of Chains. It was the farthest edge of the British Empire, a forgotten colony meant to hold the worst of the worst men, who had defied the crown murderers, thieves soldiers who refused orders. They were sent across half the world on rotting ships to live and die behind stone walls and iron gates. The journey took months. Many never survived the sea. Those who did faced something worse than death: cold hunger, isolation, and the slow crushing of the soul. The main prison was Port Arthur, built by convict hands from the very earth that imprisoned them. Every morning, the sound of the whip echoed through the fog as guards dragged men from their cells to cut timber or carve stone shackles clanked on bleeding ankles. The screams of punishment echoed through the hills. The British government called it reformation, but the convicts called it hell. The guards ruled with iron, and hunger was their weapon. The men dreamed of escape, but where could they go? Beyond the gates lay forests thicker than nightmares, filled with snakes and swamps and miles of nothingness. Beyond that, the sea cold, merciless, and endless. They said no man had ever escaped Port Arthur alive. Yet among those men were a few who refused to die behind walls. Their eyes held the fire of defiance, and their hearts whispered of freedom, even if freedom meant death. The story begins with them. The convicts who reached Tasmania were not born monsters. Most were desperate men, victims of a cruel empire that punished poverty as harshly as murder. A boy who stole bread to feed his sister, a soldier who struck a cruel officer, a farmer who spoke against the crown. They were all labeled criminals and chained together on ships bound for the edge of the world. The journey was a nightmare. The hold stank of sweat, sickness, and fear. The waves smashed against the hull as rats crawled over sleeping bodies. When the convicts finally saw land, they wept not with joy but with dread. For this land was not freedom, it was another cage. At Port Arthur, they were numbered, stripped, and beaten, their names replaced by numbers, their lives reduced to labor. They built roads and prisons, knowing each stone they laid might become the wall that held them forever. Yet in their misery, small sparks of humanity remained. They sang old songs at night, whispered stories of home, and spoke in low voices about escape. The guards mocked them, saying no man could survive the wilderness or the sea, but dreams have a way of surviving where bodies cannot. Among the convicts there was talk of a man who had once sailed the southern seas, a man who claimed he could read the stars and build a raft from driftwood. His name was Alexander Pierce, and his story would soon stain Tasmania with both horror and legend. Alexander Pierce was an Irishman, small, wiry, and cunning. He had been sent to Tasmania for theft, but what he became was something the world had never seen. The guards called him the Devil of Macquarie Harbor, a place even worse than Port Arthur. It was a prison within a prison, a settlement surrounded by mountains, dense forests, and storm-filled seas. No fences were needed because nature itself was the wall. In 1822, Pierce and 7 other convicts decided they would rather die running than live in chains. They slipped into the forest with stolen axes and a few crumbs of bread. The rain fell. For days their clothes rotted on their backs and the leeches sucked their blood. The wilderness of Tasmania was a nightmare of cold hunger and endless green. They tried to follow the rivers, thinking they would lead to the coast, but the land twisted and swallowed them. Days turned into weeks. The men grew weaker, the food was gone, and madness began to whisper in their ears. What happened next would shock even the Empire. When Pierce was finally captured, he was alone. His clothes, torn, his eyes, hollow and his hands trembling. He told the guards a story they refused to believe. He said the others were dead, eaten one by one, as hunger drove them beyond reason. The officials called him a liar. They sent him back to the same hell from which he had fled. But the truth was darker than anyone imagined, and the legend of the man who ate his way to freedom had only begun. When Alexander Pierce was sent back to Macquarie Harbor, the guards laughed and said the devil had returned to his home. They chained him heavier than before and watched him with suspicion. But the wilderness outside the walls still called to him like a curse. Within months he joined another group of desperate men who planned to escape again. This time the convicts carried no illusions. They knew the forest would kill them. They knew the hunger would return, yet they ran anyway. They broke from the camp during a storm, slipping through the rain and vanishing into the trees. Behind them the guards fired blindly, into the dark. For days the convicts pushed through the jungle, starving and soaked. Their boots fell apart, their skin blistered, and the cold tore at their bones. When the first man collapsed, the others stared at him with hollow eyes. Fear and hunger became one thing inside their hearts, and the nightmare began again. Pierce would later confess that the forest seemed to whisper to him in the wind. He said the trees watched as men became beasts. When he was captured the second time, he did not deny what he had done. He looked at the judge and said, "It is the hunger that does it." They hanged him soon after. The guards said he died, laughing, but the legend said the devil of Tasmania never truly died. He lived in every convict who stared at the forest and dreamed of escape. While the story of Pierce spread through the empire, the prison of Port Arthur continued to grow. The convicts built their own cages, stone by stone under the lash of their masters. They carved the church, the barracks, the hospital, and the gallows. The overseers said they were building order, but the convicts said they were building tombs. Every corner of Port Arthur smelled of damp earth and sweat. The air was thick with the echo of chains. The punishment cells were carved deep into the hill walls, black and silent. Men were locked there for days without light or sound. Some emerged broken, some never emerged at all. The guards claimed it was a test of repentance, but it was closer to torture. The British officials wrote reports about progress and civilization, but they never saw the madness behind the walls. Yet even here, whispers of escape never stopped spreading. Some convicts began to map the coastline in their minds. They memorized the tides, the guards' routines, the weak spots in the fences. They watched the boats that came for supplies and dreamed of hiding among the cargo. The dream of freedom was a disease no punishment could cure. By the late 1800s, Port Arthur had become a legend of despair, yet the will to escape never died. Among the prisoners were men who had once been sailors, and they looked to the sea for hope. They stole scraps of timber rope and nails from the docks and hid them under the workshops. At night they whispered about tides and currents, about how far the nearest shore might be. Some believed it was possible to cross the black water and reach the mainland. Others said the sea was alive, that it swallowed men whole. One night a group of 6 convicts made their move. They slipped through the fog toward the bay, carrying a raft built from stolen planks bound with rags. The wind howled as they pushed into the waves. Behind them the guards found the broken gate and raised the alarm. Cannons fired into the mist, but the convicts were already lost at sea. For days no one knew if they had drowned or vanished into the world. Weeks later, a fisherman found a single plank washed ashore marked with a convict number scratched by hand. No bodies, no raft, no answers. Some said the men were free. Some said the sea had taken them. But the story spread that maybe, just maybe, the island of chains had been broken that night. The storm that night tore the sky apart. The guards searched for days along the cliffs and beaches, finding nothing but wreckage. The governor ordered silence, saying no one could know that men had slipped through the empire's grip. But in nearby villages, people began whispering of strangers in the night. Some fishermen swore they saw shapes moving along the shore barefoot, half-starved, hiding among the rocks. No one could prove it. Yet the rumors grew that the convicts had made it across the channel. The authorities called it impossible, but fear began to creep into their hearts. If a few desperate men could defy the sea, what else could escape their control? Weeks turned into months. The forests and mountains swallowed all trace of the missing convicts. The guards spoke of ghosts haunting the coastline. They said they heard voices in the fog calling their names. Some believed the men had died. Others believed they had found freedom among the wild tribes who lived beyond the Empire's reach. Either way, the legend grew. The island of chains no longer seemed unbreakable. The prisoners began to look toward the sea with new hope and new hunger. For the first time in years, the word freedom no longer felt like a dream, but like a wound that refused to heal. The warden of Port Arthur was a man of iron. Yet even he could not escape the whispers. The sea had taken men before, but never like this. The silence of their disappearance felt like mockery. He doubled the guards and ordered the convicts beaten for any sign of disobedience. The chains grew heavier and the nights darker, yet something had changed in the air. The prisoners walked with their heads higher and their eyes sharper. They had seen that escape was not impossible, and that knowledge was poison to the Empire. The warden dreamed of waves and shadows. He woke in cold sweat, hearing the sound of oars that were not there. The fear that once belonged to the convicts now lived in the heart of their keeper. The island of chains was no longer just a prison. It was alive, feeding on the terror of those who ruled it. Years passed and the prison filled with new faces. Men who had never known freedom were born within its walls. They worked and slept under the same gray sky, believing the world beyond was only a myth. But sometimes at night the wind carried strange sounds from the coast. The guards called them tricks of the sea, but the convicts said it was the voices of the lost sailors calling home. The silent ones, they called them spirits of the men who had escaped and now watched over those still trapped. Their whispers became prayers among the prisoners, a promise that someone had made it, a hope that refused to die. Time eroded even the strongest walls. The Empire shifted, and the world began to change. The cost of keeping the prison grew too great and the stories too dark. In the late 1800s, the gates of Port Arthur finally closed. The guards left their posts, and the cells stood empty. The wind moved through the corridors like a ghost. The island of chains was silent again, but not defeated. The land remembered every scream, every lash, every dream of escape. And in that silence, the legend endured. The Hell of Tasmania had ended, but its story had only begun. After the prison closed, the island grew quiet, but the silence carried weight. Travelers who came to see the ruins spoke of strange sounds echoing through the empty halls. Footsteps on stone, voices in the dark. Some said it was the wind, others said it was the men who never left. The locals avoided the place after sunset. They said the ghosts of Port Arthur did not rest easy. The sea around the island seemed colder, the fog thicker. Boats passed by without stopping. The British called it superstition, but deep down they feared what they had created. A prison built on pain cannot simply die. It lingers, waiting for those who dare to remember. The stones still hold the stories carved by bleeding hands. The island of chains had become a tomb for its own sins. Many years later, an old fisherman told a story that few believed. He said that when he was a boy, his father found a man washed ashore during a storm. The man was weak, sunburned, and spoke with a strange accent. He carried a rusted chain around his wrist and a wooden carving of a ship. The fisherman swore the man called himself a convict of Port Arthur. He said he had crossed the sea many years ago with others, but only he survived. The villagers fed him and he vanished the next morning. Leaving the chain behind, some said he returned to the sea. Some said he never existed. But the carving of the ship remained a silent witness to the impossible story of survival. Even after the empire faded, the name Port Arthur remained a wound on history. The people of Tasmania built homes and lives around the ruins, but could not forget the screams buried beneath their soil. Visitors came from far away to walk the old paths and touch the cold walls. They spoke of feeling watched as if the island itself remembered. The curse of memory bound every soul who stood there, reminding them of what men can do to one another in the name of order. The Hell of Tasmania was no longer a prison of chains. It was a prison of remembrance. And every whisper of wind across the water carried the voices of those who had once dared to dream of escape. Decades passed, and history tried to bury the truth under the dust of progress. But the land refused to forget. The records of Port Arthur told only half the story written by those who ruled and punished. The other half lived in whispers among the descendants of convicts, in the stories told by firelight when the wind blew. From the south they spoke of men who reached the mainland of Tasmania, who hid in the forests, who took new names and built new lives. The empire called them ghosts, but the land called them sons. The truth of their escape could never be proven yet. It was felt in every shadow and every wave. The British Empire had tried to erase its cruelty behind the word reform, but the blood of the punished still stained the soil. The men who escaped carried more than chains, they carried the weight of every prisoner who ever dreamed of freedom. Some died unknown. Some became legends, but all of them broke a piece of the cage. History may never write their names, but the ocean remembers, and the forest keeps their footsteps hidden beneath the leaves. Every gust of wind that sweeps across the coast still whispers their defiance. Freedom may have been fleeting, but it was real for a moment, and that moment was worth everything. Today the ruins of Port Arthur stand as a museum, a monument, and a warning. The walls are cracked and the chains lie rusted under the sun. Tourists walk the same paths where men once crawled for their lives. They hear the stories and take pictures, but the true weight of the place can only be felt in silence when the evening mist rises from the water and the cries of birds echo like the voices of the past. It feels as if the island itself is breathing, still alive, still watching. The ghosts of the convicts are not cruel. They are patient, waiting for the world to listen to what they suffered and what they sought. The Hell of Tasmania has become a story of endurance, of pain, and of the unbreakable human will. The island of chains may have fallen, but its spirit lives in every man who refuses to kneel before injustice. The waves crash against the shore again and again like a heartbeat, a reminder that even in the darkest prisons there will always be someone who dares to dream of the sea.